Hey guys, welcome back. So today I brought home this Generac XG8000e. This one I found on Facebook Marketplace for only $100. According to the seller, it runs, it makes power, but it didn't run very well. So the seller actually took the carb apart, put it back together, and says that it's even worse now. So we do have some carb issues. We're also missing some parts. We have no filter, no airbox cover, and the starter recoil we have, but it's not complete. The dogs that engage the starter cup are missing, as well as the bolt that holds everything together. So we're not going to be able to start it with that. But this does have electric start. And of course, the battery is stone cold dead. So I think that's going to be one of the first things we fix. This machine, I would say, is definitely worth fixing because this engine, it is made in the US. It is a Generac made engine. I believe the generator is also a low THD generator. And according to the clock, we only have 73 hours on this machine. So it should have plenty of life left in it. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on it. So first things first, let's check the oil. Make sure we have some. And we do. It's a little bit low and pretty dark. So the oil, it needs to be changed. But let's make it earn its oil change. It should be enough in there to test with. So the XG series, they're not my favorite machines to work on. They're not really made with service in mind. A perfect example is the dead battery. Usually they're down here. You can just charge them, swap them out, easy enough. In this case, it's actually mounted, I think, sideways behind the rail, and you can't access it with the tank in place. So we do need to get this out of the way. I think first, though, I am going to drain the tank because there is fuel in here. And judging by the smell, I don't think it's very fresh. Thankfully, though, it looks like we are fairly rust-free, so I don't think the tank is going to be an issue. So let's just pull the line right here where the fuel filter is and get that old fuel out of there. And let's actually have a look in the tank because the gauge says we're empty, but my nose says otherwise. And yeah, there's a little bit of fuel down there. Actually, not a whole lot. A little bit of rust, a little bit of debris, but not too bad. So I'm thinking instead of trying to drain the tank through here, we're not going to get it all. So actually, let's just get the bolts out that hold the tank, and we'll remove the fuel valve. We'll just drain it out that way. That way, we're sure to kind of flush out any debris that's floating around in there. I'm noticing, too, we're missing hardware for the tank. The two bolts on this side are not present, so we only have two here. And once those are removed, usually you can lift the tank out of the way, but due to the design, you can't actually do that. You have to remove this side rail first, remove this hose for the tank vent, then the tank should slide out the side. And this right here, that is the bracket that holds the battery in place on its side. So the battery's long gone. Thankfully, the bracket and all the hardware is still present. So we will need to replace that. As far as the tank goes, it's not exactly what I was expecting to see. Most Honda clones, they have a removable fuel valve, and once removed, kind of provides a pretty big opening to pour out any debris. You know, in this case, we just have a pipe welded into the tank, so may not get all the debris out, but we'll get what we can out and mop up the rest. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself with the tank. I'm going to come back to that later. You know, I first want to get the engine running, make sure it runs well, that the engine's not knocking, and we're making power. So before trying to start it, I do want to get this heat shield off. It's going to provide better access to the engine as well as the carburetor. So the heat shield, it's held on just by a nut and a bolt on each side. Well, actually, that one is already missing, so we'll add that to the ever-growing list of missing hardware. It's already loose. Well, there was supposed to be a bolt right there holding the other side on, but yep, that's missing too. With that heat shield removed, we can now see the carburetor. And, you know, I was concerned, you know, given all the hardware so far that's missing, and I know that the prior owner was in here, I was concerned that maybe this linkage was not connected properly. You know, the governor rod is, though, connected to the governor arm as well as the carburetor. So I think we should be safe for contact. So I am going to feed a little bit of fuel directly into the carb. And I guess before we do that, we need to add a battery. And I'm going to take a second and just vacuum this stuff up as well. It looks like there is some evidence that a critter was in here at some point. All right, let's give the starter a try. Okay, good. The starter seems to work, although it's having a lot of trouble getting over top dead center. And I'm thinking or hoping that maybe the valves are misadjusted. So before cranking it over anymore, I'm going to pull the valve cover and just check for excessive valve clearance. These bolts are pretty loose. So I'd say someone's been in here, which is a good thing. That means there's a chance they just set the valves wrong. Yeah, it feels like there's a ton of clearance on the exhaust especially, but both valves I think are excessive. But the exhaust, yeah, it feels like a lot. So let me rotate the engine until the intake is open, and then we'll get a feeler gauge and just see where we're at on the exhaust valve. All right, the intake is open, so we can check the exhaust. Now, I haven't looked up the specs yet on this, but usually, valves on engines like this are between 4 and 8 thousandths. So I'm going to start with 8, which I think would be the extreme high side, and that just falls right into there. So I'm going to skip right ahead to 24 thousandths. And yeah, that still fits. Let's do a 23 and a 24 thousandths. Still fits. Let's just add 2 more. I think this is the 22 and the 21. So this is about 100 thousandths. And it doesn't fit. So we're somewhere, I would say, between, like, that's 70 right there. So probably between 80 and 100 thousandths for that gap. That is way, way too big. So that would explain why the compression's so high, because on the compression stroke, the decompression system is supposed to just barely bump the exhaust valve to let some exhaust out. And it probably is bumping it, but the gap is so big, it doesn't actually bump the valve. It just maybe moves the rocker a little bit, and that's pretty much it. So let's check the intake. So I'm going to rotate the engine until the exhaust is open, and we'll check the clearance on the intake. All right, the exhaust valve is open. So we'll start with the 18 thousandths. Too big. Let's go for the 24 thousandths. And too big, although we're getting close. So this one's probably like 25, maybe 30 thousandths, but that's still too big of a gap. So let me look up the specs on this, and then we'll set these properly. So I just took a quick look online at the owner's manual, and it doesn't list the valve lash specs for this engine. So likely there is a separate engine manual for this, which I haven't found yet. So until I find it, I am going to adjust these valves to 4 thousandths and 6 thousandths. That's a pretty safe bet, certainly way better than it is right now. We can always revisit this later, but I think after making that adjustment, the engine hopefully will turn over a lot easier. And this is supposed to be an Allen wrench to make this adjustment, but I don't have one that big, so just going to have to do it without. So right there I have some drag. So I'm just going to snug that up, and then we'll do the exhaust. All right, a 6 is tight. And so is a 4. So let's see if we can back this up a little. Nope, we got to loosen that nut. All right, a 4 feels pretty good. And a 5 is really tight. So we're somewhere between a 4 and a 5. I think that's fine. Let's adjust the exhaust. 6 is actually tight. Let's check a 5. 5 feels pretty good, so yeah, I think we're okay. It's a little tighter than I would like, but you know, I don't know the exact specs, and honestly, anything close is way better. So let me turn the engine over now, see if it can make it over the compression stroke without struggling. Yeah, so that is quite a bit better. So I'm just going to double check these lock nuts, make sure they're snug. You know, this time it turned over without struggling to get through the compression stroke. So now the decompression system's working. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that whatever run issue the previous owner had may have been at least partially self-inflicted, because there's no way those valves did that to themselves. You know, I'm thinking, you know, likely he adjusted it and he was on the wrong stroke. Most manuals say to adjust the valves while on top dead center. And a lot of people don't realize the piston's at the top twice. One is top dead center of the compression, which is where you should adjust the valves, actually just a touch past. And the other time the piston's at the top, it's top dead center of the exhaust stroke. And you don't want to set the valves there because you're actually in valve overlap. One valve's closing, the exhaust valve, and the other one's opening, the intake. So they're kind of halfway seated, or half open, half closed, however you want to look at it. So, you know, if he adjusted the valves like that and then rotated the engine, the clearance would have become like we just saw. I think the compression being so high due to the improper valve adjustment might also explain kind of what happened over here with the starter recoil. With compression that high, it would have been very hard to pull the engine over manually. That's how you break ropes. That's how you hurt yourself, and also break the components that spin the engine. So yeah, no big surprise. Anyway, let's get some fuel in here and see if the carb is any good. We're flooding over. Yeah, we are flooding over. So the needle and seat, they are not working. So I'm tempted to start it even like this, but we have leaked quite a bit of fuel. And yeah, I think it's unavoidable. We need to go in and clean that carb up. This choke mechanism, it's attached to the airbox, so you can't get the airbox off until you remove the cable. All right, so let's have a look in here. You know, judging by what I see in the throat of the carb, it's probably not going to be in great shape. I see some corrosion, some varnish, and we're continuing to leak out of this carb. So, well, the bolt was loose, for starters. So that could have been the source of the leak. The bolt doesn't look too bad. There is some varnish on it, but it looks to be fairly rust-free. And the bowl, not too bad. Again, some varnish, but I don't think there's really much rust. So that should clean up pretty well. I'm also noticing we're missing a gasket. There should be one right there on this bolt to form a seal. So that could have been the problem right there. The carb itself actually looks a lot better than I kind of imagined. The needle is not stuck. We do have a bowl seal. So yeah, everything seems to be here with the exception of this gasket right here. But given the varnish, both in the throat and in the bowl, I think we should fully get this apart. Easier said than done. So the pin seems to be stuck. So let me just tap that a little bit, see if we can get some movement out of it. No, I don't think so. So I might leave good enough alone for right now. Might have to let this soak a bit in the ultrasonic. So let's try to get out the main jet at least. And there might be a pilot jet right in there as well, so we'll check that out. There we go. Nope, that's not budging either. So I might try the impact. Otherwise, we'll just let it soak and we'll check back. There we go. And there might be a jet down there. It's really hard to see in there. Yeah, it's a tiny little pilot jet. I almost couldn't get it out. It's pretty gummed up in there. And that's it for now. I'm going to let it soak for 5 or 10 minutes, and we'll try back on this needle and float. All right, let's see how we're making out. It's been 5 minutes. Bowl's looking a lot better. Could use a bit more time. And the carb actually has cleaned up really well. So let's try this pin again. Hopefully it'll come out. So it's important to proceed with caution here. These arms, they can break, especially on Mikunis, which this is not. This is a Nikki carb. So these are beefier and harder to break, but they can break. So do not use excessive force trying to get the pin out. Yeah, let's try this in the vise. Ah. Yeah, I just did what I warned against, and that was break the arm off that holds the pin in place. So, I didn't think I was hitting it that hard, but apparently I was because, well, this is no longer attached to that. So this carb is no longer usable. We could get creative and try to reattach that, but I don't think that's going to be a great repair. Plus, I have another option. I checked all my bins. I did find another Generac carb, but it's from a much smaller engine. So this one is out. But I do have a Generac XG8000 parts machine in storage. I was going to raid that anyway for some of the other parts we need, like the filter and the airbox cover and some of the missing hardware. So we're going to add carburetor to that list. And I think the trip to the storage locker just moved up in priority. So this is the parts generator I was talking about. It's also an XG8000e. I actually picked it up about a year ago. I got it for free and for good reason. Supposedly it doesn't make power. So I did pull the cover off the generator just to take a look. And what I saw was that all the wires were disconnected. And even more concerning was that the rotor bolt wasn't threaded into the crankshaft. So I tried to thread it in and it wouldn't go. So most likely, someone botched removing this generator and they damaged the threads on the crankshaft. So although the engine might be good, if we can't attach a new generator to it, it's not going to be of much use. So I'm fairly confident this is a parts machine. Maybe I'll do a video on it in a few weeks just to see if there's any chance of reviving it. But for now, it is a parts machine. We need to harvest the parts we need. And in the future, if we find out that this is viable, we can always replace those parts. So let me get this out into the open. We'll take the parts we need and hopefully get that other machine up and running. Yeah, this machine's in worse shape than I thought. The back of the airbox, it is all blown out. Thankfully, though, the cover is in good shape, and that is the part we need. I've got all the other hardware we need. The only thing left is the carb, and unfortunately, it's not coming off. The nut on the right will not spin off the stud. The whole stud is spinning, and these studs, they don't go in the block. They're actually held in place by, I think, the plastic insulator, so that must be blown out as well. So to get this off, I'm either going to have to cut it off or maybe use some vice grips to hold that stud still. And unfortunately, I did not bring either of those tools with me. So I'm going to pause it. I'm going to return in a second, hopefully with the tools I need to get this carb off. Okay, so this one looks decent from the outside. And I can see we have the missing gasket for that bolt, so we're off to a good start. Hopefully the inside looks good. A little bit of corrosion. And yeah, not great, although it's not rust. That should clean up, so I think the bowl will be fine. I notice we have a plug right there, which I think this is the pickup for the pilot circuit. And normally that picks it up from actually inside there. So I don't remember seeing that on the other carb. So that could have been a problem. This carb may not have run very well without that. Needle is not stuck. Of course the pin is. So yeah, let's not have a repeat of the last one. So let's try to get the main jet out. And nope, I'm breaking the main jet. Jeez. All right, so this carb is going to get soaked. We'll try the main jet again. You know, worst case, I can get that off with some vice grips, and we can use the jet from the other carb. That one came off clean, but this pin has me nervous. Although the throat of this carb looks a million times better. So I think this carb has a chance, as long as I don't break it. Let's try to get that pilot jet out. Yeah, this one's coming apart a lot easier. At least the pilot circuit is. Okay, we'll soak this for a bit and try this again. Let's give this another go. It's been in the ultrasonic for about 5 minutes. You know, I'm also noticing the bowl gasket seems like it was pinched and damaged. So that should be replaced. Let's try the main jet. Yeah, and that came right out this time. And I don't suppose we're gonna get lucky on this pin. So it's in there really tight. So I'm going to leave good enough alone. Unless that needle isn't working, I'm not going to force the issue. So it cleaned up pretty well. Not perfect though. There is still some discoloration in the bowl as well as on the carburetor itself. That said though, I think it has a pretty good chance of running the engine well. So I'm going to put it together. I might steal a few parts from the parts carb just to make this one as perfect as we can. So let's actually steal the first part. We'll try to get that bowl gasket out. Yeah, it's stuck in there pretty good, so hopefully it comes out. Okay, that should do. Get the main jet back in. And I'm actually going to use the bowl from the other carb. I think it's in better condition. So we'll put that on. And last but not least, the pilot jet. Okay, let's try it out. Yeah, thankfully this gasket's good. The one that goes between the carb and the engine. Can't say the same about the airbox one. We are going to have to make one or buy one, but I want to see that this runs and that it runs well before ordering or making any parts. All right, the needle and seat, they seem to be working. We are filled right to the top. So let's crank the engine and see what we get. All right, let's give this a try. I've got a light plugged in and turned on, and I also reconnected the choke. So let's choke the engine. We'll crank it, and hopefully it comes to life. Well, we took the long road, but we are finally here. Things weren't looking too good after I destroyed the original carburetor. Thankfully I had a parts machine with a carburetor on it. Granted, said machine didn't want to let go of it, but we kept at it and eventually got it off. And I am glad we did, because this carburetor is running the engine perfectly. The engine started right up. I could turn the choke off right away, and things ran nice and smooth. This engine sounds great, and we're making power, so things are looking pretty good. I would say this has definitely earned its oil change, but I'm going to hold off changing the oil because this is actually a pressurized lube system, which you don't see in a lot of generators. Because of that, we do have an oil filter, so I want to order a new one of those up before changing the oil. And while I'm at it, I'm going to get a new air filter ordered up, as well as the gasket we need for the airbox. Well, it's been a few days, and the parts, they've shown up. We have a new oil filter, a new air filter, and a new gasket for between the carburetor and the airbox. So between these parts and the parts we stole from the other machine, we should have everything we need to get this back together. So we got one last thing to do here, which is drain the fuel. It's not a ton in here, but the stuff that is in here, it's definitely bad. Smells like paint thinner. It's pretty dark in color, and there are chunks of rust coming out. Well, thankfully, there wasn't a lot of fuel in that tank. And although the color and the smell are off, there's also no water, which is a good thing, because if there was, we would have a lot more rust. Instead, we just have just a few little bits and not much more in the tank. So I'm going to just mop out kind of the residue that's left in the tank, and then we should be ready to proceed. Gonna leave the tank bolts kind of loose for now until we get all the panels fitted, and then we'll circle back and snug everything down. So I'm going to try to sneak this gasket in. Otherwise, we're going to have to remove the cable for the choke, which we do have clearance. Yeah, let's just run it again real quick before changing the oil. So the oil, it's pretty dark. I mean, for a machine that with only 73 hours on it, you know, this could potentially be the original oil. And I guess on the good news side, there's no hint of metallic in that oil, so likely the engine is in good shape. It'll be interesting to see how this generator performs. You know, I have tested these before, but it was before I owned the load bank and the THD meter, so I don't truly know its limit or how clean it is. You know, according to the sticker, this can pull 8,000 watts, and if that's true, this will actually be the heaviest load I've ever put on a single cylinder engine. So the plan is just to get it started, we'll let it warm up. While it's doing that, we will double check the outputs. And then I'm going to bring the load on. You know, 3,000 watts, we'll see how it does. If it's going well, we will double the load to 6,000 watts. And assuming everything looks good, we will go for the max of 8,000 watts. So we started kind of slow at about 58.5 Hertz. The voltage, it was also low at 100 volts. So I increased the spring tension on the governor. We're now running at about 61.5 Hertz. And the voltage came up to 114 volts. The THD without a load isn't too bad. It's at 4.2%. And the sine wave doesn't look super clean, but it's also not that bad. So let's start by bringing a 3,000 watt load on. It's handling it. Yeah, it's a little bit unsteady, and I kind of hear a hissing sound from the exhaust, so I wonder if potentially the spark arrestor is clogged. The THD, about the same, 4.6%, and not much change to the sine wave. So let's give it a couple minutes. We'll see if it keeps going without issue. So no issues handling the 3000 watts. The engine speed is largely unchanged at 61.5 Hertz. And the voltage came up to 125 volts, so things are looking pretty good. So let's swap 1000 for a 2, which will bring it up to 4. And you can see the engine, it is oscillating. Actually, let me bring it up slowly to 4, because I don't like what's going on here. So I'm going to bring 1000 back on. 3500. 4,000. So it can do 4,000 watts, so let's bring on a quick 2. So we're back at 4,000. Let's try 6,000. It's doing it, but nope. It was going to stall. So something isn't quite right, and I'm suspicious of that exhaust. So let's let it cool down, and then we will shut the generator down and check that spark arrestor. Oh yeah, look at all that carbon just falling out. So this thing is plugged. So I'm going to leave this out for now. The screen itself is fine, but it's just holding back a lot of junk. So if I start it now, all that should come shooting out. So I'm actually going to roll the load bank out of the way, because that's right kind of in the path of all this junk. So we'll just start it up, let it clear out, and then we'll try this again. I'm kind of surprised that that's all that came out. You know, the exhaust was definitely restricted. You know, I could hear it hissing and just struggling to breathe. So now that the spark arrestor's out, there's nothing holding back those chunks. So I'm actually going to leave it out for the load test, because I want anything left in there to fly out when we start applying a heavy load. So I'm going to get it started again, and we'll start bringing on the load again. And hopefully this time we can make it closer, if not to, its rated load of 8,000 watts. All right, so let's try this again. Without a load, of course, we're still at the low 4% range on the THD, and the sine wave looks the same as it did before. So let's bring on a load. I'm going to start actually with 3,000 watts. No issues pulling the 3,000. THD, like last time, only came up a little bit to 4.6%, and the sine wave cleaned up just a bit. So I'll let this run for a few minutes, then we'll try 6,000 watts again. All right, no issues at 3,000 watts. So let's swap 1,000 for a 2, which will bring it up to 4,000. No issues. Let's try 6,000. It's getting pretty loud, but it's holding nice and steady. THD, 4.9%. The sine wave looks unchanged. So let's give this a couple minutes, and then we'll go for the max. So no issues pulling the 6,000 watts. The engine speed is holding very well at just above 60 Hertz. And the voltage is also doing quite well at 125 volts. So let's see if we can do the max here. So we're at 6 now. We'll add another 1,000. So we're at 7, 7,500, 8,000. It's holding. We're at 4.8%, so pretty impressive. And the sine wave looks unchanged. So yeah, not too bad. Alright, it's been a few minutes. It's under quite a bit of stress. I'm going to start taking the load off, and it's actually struggling now, so let me kill the master. Let me turn it back on. So we do have a little bit of hunting going on now, which I don't like. So interesting. So after a heavy load, it has a little bit of an issue keeping the engine speed steady. Of course, now we have no load and it's running well. Let's try 3,000 again. Yeah, that's not good. Actually, before I shut it down, I want to try one more thing. And I'm going to put a load back on so we get surging. So right there, 2,000 watts is surging, but it is definitely not stabilizing. So let me give it a little bit of choke. Yeah, it might be just a little bit lean. It's hard to say. So at 3,000 watts doesn't really improve. 4,000 watts it smooths out. So what about 3,000? Not really. 2,000, no. Doesn't really get better with choke. Yeah, I'm not sure if this is a fuel issue or not. I can still hear it a little. Although it does mostly go away with the right amount of choke, so it might be choke. Of course, without a load, it's good. 500 watts, it's good. It starts at about 1,000 watts. I think it goes away at around 3 or 4. Yeah, 4,000 it goes away. So I'm thinking the pilot circuit might be to blame here. So I'm thinking we are likely dealing with a fuel problem, but I'm not completely sure. You know, when I applied partial choke, the engine did smooth out, but it wasn't quite right still. I could still hear the surge a bit. So maybe fuel, maybe not. The other possibilities are the anti-surge spring, which is on the governor rod. And I just looked up there and I can see that the spring is present and it appears to be in the right spot. So you can just see it right there. So I don't think that's the issue. The other possibility is someone may have adjusted the location where the governor spring is or the governor rod, which would change the sensitivity of the governor system. And that is going to be hard to check because we can't actually see it without taking everything apart. So for now, I think I'm going to do the easy thing. I actually picked up a clone carb for an XG8000. The plan was to use this on the one in the storage locker that I stole the carb from to put on this machine. So, you know, I've never tested a clone for this generator. It likely doesn't run the engine as well as that, but you never know. You know, worst case, it's going to give us some good information as to whether it's a fuel problem or whether this carb is any good. So let's get the OEM carb off. We'll put the clone carb on and we'll try this again. You know, I just remembered we can't do this because the choke is attached to the airbox. So we need to take the side panel off at least to gain access to that choke cable. And with any luck, we can get it disconnected without taking this whole machine apart. So I was able to reach up there and get the choke cable off. Too hard to film, but you guys saw it before. The only difference is this time there was just enough room for the wrench. It's interesting, the clone carb, it included a fuel line that was for a Honda clone, which is a 3/16 inner diameter line, which this is not. This takes 1/4 inch. Anyway, let's get this back into position and see if it's any good. Governor rod won't go in. So I can't get the governor rod in this hole right here. So it's not from lack of trying, it just doesn't fit. And if you compare it side by side to the original, I think you'll see why. The clone is on the right, original is on the left. It's a completely different size. I mean, it's almost twice the diameter of the clone. So there's no way the carburetor will go on to the generator that it's meant to go on, at least not without modifications. So I am going to attempt to drill that a little bit bigger, and we'll try this again. Yeah, might work. So this is the type of thing, when you buy a clone carburetor, you can't expect much. Sometimes they work. I've actually tried these clones on smaller Generac engines, and they worked pretty well. So I'm still optimistic. But given that the governor linkage doesn't fit without modification, tells me that, whoever designed this didn't really pay too close attention to the details. And here's the second problem. This little tab right here hits the top of the airbox, so you can't actually put the airbox on. So it serves no purpose as far as I know. So I'm going to cut that off and see if we can then get the airbox back on. So the clone carb, it is fully installed. I am going to leave the side panel out for now because I think there is a pretty high probability that that carb is not going to run the engine too well. So let's get it started and find out. The engine does sound pretty good without a load. So let's bring on a light load. I think with the other carb we started surging at about 1,000 watts. So we got 1,000 watts on, things are pretty steady. Let's go for 1,500, 2,000, pretty stable. Little surge at 2,000 watts. 3,000 is pretty good. 3,500, 4,500, both good. So at 5,000, 6,000, no issue. 6,000 again. 7, nope. So the clone carb is maxed out at 6. If I try to go to 7, nope, can't do 7. I would say the clone carb is a fail. I had to shut the engine down faster than I wanted and shut the fuel valve off because the engine was flooding pretty bad. I noticed when I took the load off, the engine was no longer running well. And the reason for it was because it was getting way too much fuel. So, potentially that's why we maxed out at 6,000 watts. If we fix the flooding issue, then maybe this carb would do better. It was definitely doing well from no load all the way up to 6,000 watts, and then it fell on its face. But given all the issues with this carb so far, the incorrect size for the governor rod, the choke that didn't allow the airbox to install, and now we have a brand new carburetor flooding everywhere, I don't think this carb should stay on here. So I'm going to pause it here. I'm going to go through the OEM carb one more time, and then we'll give it one more chance. So the clone is off, and I put the OEM carburetor back on. I did go through it thoroughly and didn't find anything other than a little bit of debris in the bowl. So I cleaned that out. The pilot jet also looked good, but I did swap it anyway with the other carb, the one that originally came on this machine, the one that I broke. So there is a small difference in the carburetor. So potentially that might make the difference. If it doesn't, then I am still suspicious of the governor spring location. It seems to be in the right spot, but even after starting the engine, for about a second it surges, and I don't think that's a carburetor surge. I think that's a governor surge. So if it's still doing it, I'm going to move that governor spring to a different spot, and maybe that will be the answer to this problem. So we're back up and running. Engine sounds good. And that governor reaction, this time, it was still there, but it didn't seem quite as dramatic. So let's try 1,000 watts. Little surge. 1,500. Not too bad. Let's try 2,000. Seems good. How about 1,000? Yeah, we have a surge at 3,000, 3,500, 4,000. It's smoothed out. Let's try 5,000, 6,000. No issues there. We'll go back to 6, 7, 7.5, 8. So yeah, this carburetor does have issues, as you can see. And it's really weird. Let's try 2,000. 3,000. 5,000. 6,000. 7,000, 8,000. Very odd. So it has no problem going up slowly, but coming down, it struggles. Yeah, so a sudden load it doesn't like either. Yeah, I'm not sure about this one. I don't think the carburetor is the issue. This engine starts without issue. It idles just fine. I can bring the load up all the way to 8,000 watts, and there's no problem. The problem starts when I start taking the load off. When the load is taken off, the engine suddenly over revs and the governor has to react and slow it down. But what I think is happening is that it's overreacting and slowing it down too much. And then the governor realizes it's too slow and it overcompensates and speeds it up too much. So it's oscillating between too fast and too slow, and it's not finding that equilibrium. At least that's what I'm going with. So I do want to make that adjustment to the governor spring. I have to move it further away from the governor shaft. And on most engines, that's pretty straightforward. it's pretty straightforward on this one, other than we don't have access. So I do need to pull the tank off again, potentially the heat shield as well, to get access to that governor spring. So now we can see a couple things here. We see the anti-surge spring on the governor rod, and it's connected on this end as well as the other. Without that, there will be slop in this connection, and that can cause surging. But with the spring there, that solves that issue. This is the governor spring. This is how you adjust the engine speed. And you see there's multiple holes. The closer the spring is to the shaft, the more sensitive the engine is. If you move it too close, the engine will surge, kind of like we're seeing right now. The other thing too is that when we put this under load, it maintains speed very, very well, which tells me the governor probably is too sensitive, because usually the engines slow down by 4 to 5 hertz. And on this one, we're only slowing down by about 2 hertz. So making it less sensitive by moving the spring further away shouldn't cause an issue here. So I'm going to loosen up this nut right here. We'll move this over just one spot out. We'll restart it, reset the speed, and see if there's any improvement. All right, we're back at about 61.5 hertz. So we'll try this one more time. Let's try 2000. We'll quick turn it on. We'll turn it off. No issues. Let's do 4000. No problem. Let's turn it off. All right, let's try 6000. All right, let's take the load off. Good. And let's try 8000. right, we're at 8,000 watts. Let's take the load off. That was it. The governor, it was just a little bit too sensitive. We are finally running right. So I put this machine back together. This thing is a done deal. I actually thought it was figured out way back in the beginning when we found that the valves were grossly misadjusted. So we adjusted the valves, replaced the missing parts, and it seemed to be running just fine. At least so I thought. And then we brought it outside today and tried to load test it. And we found a couple issues. The first issue was the hissing sound, and then it buckled under 6,000 watts. So we took the spark arrestor out, blew the junk out, and at that point we could then pull the rated load of 8,000 watts, but we couldn't take the load off without the engine surging very badly. So I replaced the carb. That ended up not solving the issue, and then I checked the springs. The anti-surge spring was connected properly, and actually the governor spring I think was in the factory default position. So likely this generator has been overly sensitive since new, which was about 80 hours ago. So the prior owner definitely had a lot of issues going on at the same time. Between the valves, the exhaust, and the governor, this machine must have been running pretty poorly. Anyway, it is now finally running correctly. And it's a good thing it is, because this can actually pull 8,000 watts. And not only that, it is a low THD machine. The highest I saw was about 4.9%, which is perfectly safe for electronics as long as you're not surging. And now we're not. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching. All right, a little bit of bonus footage here. Although we couldn't get to 8,000 watts with the clone carburetor, it was doing a halfway decent job. And I need this carburetor to test the other XG in storage. I think that engine has issues, and likely it's not worth buying an OEM carburetor. So the clone carb would at least allow me to test it and see if I should order the OEM part or not. So I wanted to find the source of the leak. And I think I did actually when removing this carb. But just to make sure, I thought I would do a pressure test. And with the carb upside down, that needle should be closed and holding pressure. And it is. We're holding just fine at 6 psi. If I turn the carb right side up, the needle will open and the pressure goes to 0. So this carb actually wasn't the problem. I found the problem when removing the carburetor, and it wasn't clear to me if it happened before or after. Meaning, did I tear the line while installing the carb, or did I tear it while removing the carb? And I think based on that test, we have our answer. This got torn somehow when putting the clone on, and that's why we were leaking so badly. It wasn't actually the carb. That said though, the carb wasn't a perfect match, but it will be good at least for testing in the future.